So this week we'll look more closely at the United Nations in different aspects of international cooperation, international law, international regimes, any form of also regional integration. So in the textbook you will see more on the European Union, Association for Southeast Asian Nations, and other international organizations. Now, if you're looking at the origins of intergovernmental organizations, it really goes down back to the very core of liberal internationalism, is that we do share a community of humankind, that we do have these common values, a shared history across the world, and we have progressed from the resort of violence and constant conquest and constant living in fear to actually different forms of cooperation and diplomacy. Of course, we have different stages. The League of Nations was flawed from the very beginning. One, of course, the big flaw was the United States itself. Champion of the League of Nations, President Wilson, was then denied to actually be a member of it. So it lacked some teeth from the beginning and did not, of course, stop Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan from starting the Second World War. And now, of course, the United Nations itself is a lot more sophisticated, advanced, and mature international organizations, which was created on the ashes of the Second World War. What we really have is sort of big power peacekeeping, and that is the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is the most powerful international body in the world, because whatever the UN Security Council says, whatever resolution it passes, becomes international law. There's no other body which has that sort of authority in international relations. And of course, we had, pragmatic cooperation, which goes back hundreds of years. So we don't have to look at the League of Nations, the United Nations in the 20th century. We're looking at the Central Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine in 1815. That is the oldest one. In fact, the ITUs, the oldest surviving one, was initially the International Telegraphic Union, and now it's, of course, the International Telecommunication Union. So they're looking at the Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine. Was a very pragmatic regime, and then it became an organization because we have so many different countries which go along the River Rhine in Europe. We want to be able to navigate that river for the sake of commerce without resorting to war, without that one country downstream feels threatened by the German flags, a vessel sailing under German flags, that it would feel threatened downstream. And that really is pragmatic cooperation that, it guaranteed the free navigation on the river, which connected so many countries in Europe. And then very pragmatic, looking at, the postal union, that you put one stamp on a letter and you send it to Belgium. Belgian authorities, the Belgian postal office, will honor that American stamp, and vice versa. A parcel from France will be honored in the United States. These are things we don't necessarily think about, but these were pragmatic regimes between countries for the sake of cooperation. So that's kind of a very, very quick overview of how these organizations come about. So we have this top-down approach, like League of Nations, United Nations, big power peacekeeping, keeping security and peace in the world, and then sort of the bottom-up, so pragmatic cooperation, which necessitated some sort of more formal regime or organization. Now again, as I said, liberal internationalists say that we have moved on, that war is such a crude way of states to ensure the security and interest. They in fact have matured to other forms of resolving conflict. Now, the key difference between international institutions and international organizations is institutions or regimes are sets of norms and principles that influence state expectation. So a regime could be an agreement between two or more countries. It could be a multilateral or bilateral agreement. And these sort of regimes tell you what you ought to do. For example, a non-proliferation agreement. That several countries signed up to those documents, become state parties, and pledge that they would reduce the amount of missiles they have, or would get rid of all landmines. That would be an international regime. So it's an agreement between two, usually a lot more multilateral regime, between a lot more states to take care of one certain aspect, or they pledge themselves for a certain type of behavior. It could be environmental regime, like we discussed last week, to reduce certain emissions. Organization literally is a physical creation with staff, buildings, operating procedure, and different countries would have their embassies in these buildings or in these cities. So again, looking at the International Association the International Atomic Energy Association is seated in Vienna in Austria, and each country would have their permanent mission to that organization. So that organization itself would have a Secretary General, would have staff, international civil servants, and would have actually a physical structure, physical building. So there's sometimes regimes become organizations. Looking at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade morphed into the World Trade Organization in 1994. Also, it's seated in Geneva. So what was an initial regime where countries said, okay, we want to free trade, we don't want to have all these tariffs and taxes, we want to reduce any of these things. So for the sake of all of us conducting free trade, eventually became a proper organization. The World Trade Organization. So if you're looking at the dispute between the Trump administration, the Chinese government, the European Union, the threat of a trade war and the imposition of on trade barriers by the United States in 2018 is a violation of the World Trade Organization. So China will bring this to the attention of the World Trade Organization, saying, well, the Americans are breaking the rules. So this is, liberals would point to this entire body of order, in particular institutions, both organizations and regimes. Now, until recently, I've been looking at mid-20th century, a lot of international law really was designed to facilitate international order. International law really is only interested or only is concerned with the conduct of behavior between states. So states were the primary subject of international law. This was the 1933 Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, establishes states as a person of international law. So states here are the agents of international law. Only states can create and enforce international law, and it's a very important component of state practice. Now, because it only looked at behavior, what states were doing between themselves, it basically was like a treaty, and that law only applied to you if you, as a state party, acceded to that particular law. It's very different from living in the United States, that you say, oh, you get caught by a speeding ticket and said, well, I've never signed up to that particular law of the traffic code. Doesn't matter. You're in the United States, you're subject to US law, state law and federal law. This is not the case in international relations, where only if you as a state acceded and signed up for that particular legislation of international law would it apply to you. Now, the supranational law really, initially the scope was confined to questions of order, but not justice and protection of human rights. What we see in the trends of the last 30 years is that if you're looking at, the end of the Second World War, the Holocaust created a lot more human rights regimes. Convention against, genocide. All of the entire body of international human rights law was created after the Second World War for what the Nazis had done in Europe and elsewhere, and to a certain extent the Japanese too, of course. But genocide didn't end with the end of the Second World War. So we had Rwanda, we had former Yugoslavia, we have Sudan, Myanmar. So genocide is a recurring and ongoing condition of humanity, sadly. And what we see in the last 30 years certainly is that the international community has taken a lot greater interest and also invested a lot more political capital in intervening and actually emphasizing how countries treat their people. So unlike realists, of course, a liberal international school of thought would look at how are these states treating their citizens, if they are violating that, if they're committing atrocities, war crimes, genocide, any sort of violation en masse, they can no longer be protected by the concept of sovereignty. we in fact have a responsibility to protect and intervene. And if you're looking at the last 20 years, we have the creation of the International Criminal Court, which is a standing court. Again, you can only be tried for war crimes or human rights violations if you in fact are a state party. The United States, as you may know, is not a state party to the International Criminal Court. So what are the member states' obligation and rights looking at the United Nations? Maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, to cooperate in solving international problems and promote respect for human rights, and to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It doesn't matter whether you're Luxembourg with several 100,000 people or if you're India with over 1 billion people, you have one vote per country in the General Assembly. So it doesn't matter how big, how huge your population is or how tiny your population is. In fact, what matters is one state and one vote. So the UN General Assembly is, if you like, the parliament of nations. All states are represented in the General Assembly. Whatever the General Assembly passes are non-binding resolutions. So they have several subcommittees and committees looking at trade, migration, development, human rights, security, the environment. All of these are non-binding, but certainly carry politically quite a bit of weight. You have to keep in mind that international relations, much like high school is, image is everything. Image matters. Countries do care about being ostracized. Governments do care about being told off by the United Nations or other international organizations for breaking the rules. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the most important body of the United Nations is the UN Security Council. That's the 5 permanent members. These are basically the victorious powers after the Second World War. China, Russia, Britain, France, and the United States and Britain. I think I said Britain twice. So these 5 permanent members are really the guardians of the international community. Again, we have 15 members in total of the UN Security Council, but these 5 permanent members are a bit more equal than the rest. And that, of course, was the idea when creating the United Nations. That the great powers would have never signed up for the UN itself, much like the League of Nations back then. Would they not have an escape hatch? Would they not have a bit more privilege than the international community, than the rest? And of course, over the years, in particular the Cold War, that permanent, the permanent 5 in the UN Security Council have made use of that privilege, in particular the veto. The veto right is that any of those permanent 5 has the right to veto any legislation. If one country vetoes that resolution, it becomes void. It cannot pass. This was particularly true during the Cold War, that the Soviets would veto whatever the Americans were doing against the Soviets and vice versa. It's still true that to this day that the US vetoes a lot of resolutions concerning Israel. So the veto is still something used by countries. The Russians certainly also are making a lot of use of the veto. The most recent, kind of more famous, French veto in 2002, 2003 at the UN was denying the Bush administration a Security Council which would have legitimized the invasion of Iraq. And the French said, well, we're not convinced about the WMD claim. We will veto whatever resolution you will introduce which would call for the invasion of Iraq. So the United States and Britain did it without a UN resolution. Now, as I said, the most important aspect of the UN itself, but particularly the UN Security Council, is international peace and security. And it's up to the UN Security Council to establish when a breach of international peace and security has happened. So I mentioned earlier the Cold War use of the veto power. We had 193 vetoes between 45 and 90. And then between 1990 and 2007, we only had 19. So you can see certainly a smaller time period, but it has decreased substantially. Now we have different types of peacekeeping. And of course, peacekeeping, blue helmets, UN blue helmets, is an important aspect. Again, what you have to keep in mind is that the United Nations does not have a standing army. Whenever the UN Security Council issues a resolution which authorizes blue helmets, peacekeepers or peace enforcers, it would have to be provided by member states. Usually the Canadians, the Norwegians, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indians, Nepali, Austrians. These are countries which traditionally have a quite a substantial foreign policy commitment to peacekeeping or peace enforcement or humanitarian intervention or human rights in general. So quite a few of these are in fact coming from these countries. So classical peacekeeping, the UN force is under UN command and is placed between the parties to a dispute after a ceasefire. It's not necessary, it's not mentioned in the UN Charter, and of course the obvious shortcoming is that the warring parties must want peace. So they have to permit those UN peacekeepers to come in as a buffer zone. Peace enforcement is more likely to be used to achieve humanitarian ends, and there, as the name says, that does exactly what it says on the tin. They're enforcing peace. So they are more armed, are better armed. Both could be ground troops as well as air force, and they're really charged with terminating the conflict. Now, the key problem, of course, is like we've seen in Somalia and also the former Yugoslavia during the Civil War, that they have a harder time to remain neutral and, of course, also become fair game to be shot at by belligerent groups. Now, what I've said earlier, what is becoming a lot more common in the post-Cold War world is intervention within states. There's this challenge by the realist view that is sovereignty is sacrosanct, you mustn't violate sovereignty, but as the concept of human security has become a lot more prevalent in international diplomacy, more and more policymakers actually are driven by that concern for a shared humanity. So if you're looking, if we see that human security is under threat, the right to basic provisions, food, water, healthcare, accommodation, or war crimes are being committed, or human rights are being violated, then we've seen lately actually a commitment by the international community to intervene. The UN General Assembly Resolution 182 states the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity of states must be fully respected in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. In this context, humanitarian assistance should be provided with the consent of the affected country and in principle on the basis of an appeal by the affected country. So again, the United Nations Charter does not mention international humanitarian intervention whatsoever. In fact, it has this sort of contradictory message of the nature of the UN Charter. It deals, Article 1 with human rights and Article 2 deals with the sovereignty of states. And those are really contradictory because we're saying now, well, if this country is violating, these people, killing these people en masse, sovereignty can no longer protect that country. And this, has particularly after the end of the Cold War, when we no longer had these countries being either protected by the Soviets or by the Americans, and the progression of our understanding of our shared humanity has led to a lot more interventions. Now again, it doesn't exist in the UN Charter, so whenever countries have intervened on humanitarian grounds, it was done so because the UN Security Council issued a resolution and authorized an intervention on humanitarian grounds. So it always is on an ad hoc basis. It's not codified in the UN Charter. It doesn't exist in international law. It is up to the UN Security Council to establish, well, we have to help these people. We will authorize blue helmets to terminate the conflict or protect that particular group from being killed by the government, by militias or other proxies. So you see the UN, represents quite a lot. It creates norms against violence. That's important. Constructivists would look at that and say, well, if you look at the United Nations, what it has done since 1945, it really has changed our thinking of how we perceive international relations, how we think about gender, about security, about violence, about the environment. So, our norms have changed. It doesn't happen overnight, but it certainly has been at the forefront of the UN agenda. a debate alternative that was particularly important for the two superpowers during the Cold War. Looking at countries like Iran and the US, they still don't have relations, so a lot of things are happening at the UN, either in Geneva or in New York City. Diplomatic intervention, providing good offices, mediating, arbitrating, or in fact, education. That's by the International Court of Justice. Peace enforcement, peacekeeping, economic development, human rights, the environment, international law and norms, the quality of human existence, and also independence. Again, the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations dealt with decolonization. So it, as the British and the French empires were crumbling, particularly the British after 45, we've seen how the UN actually helped those countries regain independence and full sovereignty from their previous colonial powers. You will like the, I like to think, you will like the exercise for this week on the UN or any other regional organization.